Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today I wanted to share with you a conversation from a recent AOP Live webinar called Placing Procurement at the Intersection of Corporate Culture and Employee Experience. And in this conversation, which was hosted by Kelly Barner with my support as the voice of our live audience, we explored the role that procurement can play in corporate culture and the employee experience, and why it is so important for us to be considering these impacts, with the help of two guests. We're joined by Colin Glazier, the VP of Solutions Consulting at Zip, and Joe Frederick, Senior Director of Procurement and Sourcing at Snowflake. So let's go straight into the show, where Kelly started by asking Colin if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Yeah, good question. I would say I found procurement, but sort of through a circuitous path. I was interested in business coming out of undergrad, did consulting, came back and got an MBA, and really in the MBA program, I realized that my true passion was negotiating. I love my negotiation class. It was the thing I loved most about my career before that. And so I wanted to do something in negotiation. I thought the path there was through finance or sort of through the deal side of the options I saw in business school. And I sort of did a finance internship and actually ended up stumbling across a team that was focused on supply chain and sourcing, and realized I was I don't want to do the finance job. I want to do what those guys are doing. I want to work with external vendors and negotiate the deals and figure out the pricing and work on pulling in supply. And so that was sort of the segue. I came back full time into that role and spent the last 10 years of my career working in procurement at Intel and then at Apple, where it was a passion for me and something I truly loved.
Well, that's fascinating, Colin. I have to tell you, if I had $1 for every time somebody told me that they found procurement, I'd have about $2. It's actually super rare. Typically, it goes the other way. We probably should have arranged balloons to fall or confetti or something to mark the occasion. Joe, am I going for a third dollar here, or did procurement find you?
No, I think you're going for a third dollar. I definitely. Wow. I definitely got attached to manufacturing and planning and buying back in the late 1990s when I got into it. So became super passionate about building things with engineering teams from scratch. And then obviously it became really about the negotiation and how cheap can you make a product while maintaining a certain scope. And then over the years, definitely moved into technology and education and other places where just continued to learn about negotiations, became very passionate about it, and also operational excellence. So those are things that just passioned me through the procurement and continuing my education in procurement. So you get 3 balloons.
3 balloons. Not only have I very rarely had anybody say that they found procurement, I've sure as heck never had 2 people on together. So clearly we have the right 2 people if it's experience, positive experience that we're looking to create. Now we're going to start off today with a discussion about employee experience. And we're actually going to start right off the bat with one of the questions that came in during the registration process. Colin, I'm going to start with you, and then Joe, I'll ask the same question to you on follow-up. This question comes from Mary. What are the ways, Colin, that you can create a positive experience with business units when they're engaging with procurement? So sort of one-on-one, what's the basic things that go into creating a positive procurement experience?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of approach this. And I think you need to know your customer and what their priorities are. So I think the most important thing, and what I've done throughout my career in procurement, is spend time with my stakeholders and the people that I'm representing from the procurement side, and really understand their pain points, what they're trying to accomplish, and build a strong relationship with them. Once you have that strong relationship, everything else becomes easier because it's you know the entire scope of their challenges, and there's going to be things that you're going to have to do that are going to make their job harder. But there's also a lot of things you can do that'll make their life better. You can negotiate little add-ons and things that are going to make the product or the service better for them. You can help them get those wins that'll make them realize that procurement actually can improve what they're trying to buy, and you're not just a delay or an impact to their timeline. So getting in there and having those conversations, spending time with them, going and sitting where they sit in an office or having one-on-ones with them has been a huge part of it. And then once you do that, there's a million ways you're going to discover that you can make that experience positive for them in a variety of ways based on their needs.
Well, I actually think you've acknowledged a really important thing, that the reality is there are some parts about how procurement needs to work that are going to complicate things for people or add delays or add steps, right? Because if we didn't have those things, then we would be making finance frustrated, right? Because there's all these different competing objectives in the organization. But the sort of net has to be overall positive at the end of the day. Joe, what would you either add to what Colin's offered up generally, or maybe even say specifically about what you and your team try to do at Snowflake to ensure that the procurement experience is positive?
Yeah, Colin hit on a lot of good points. When I look at it, I try to break it down into people, process, and systems. And so, and really, we could have the entire podcast, I think, about this specifically, because there's so many different ways that procurement can engage and make a better experience from the business side. At the things we do at Snowflake, look, we hire folks that are subject matter experts. We want them in their staff meetings. Our leadership allows that. Our CIO, our CMO, other folks allow us to come and sit in their staff meeting and their direct reports meetings, so that we can be part of those projects when they get kicked off. I think Colin, brought that up as well. So being engaged from a people standpoint is super important, and hiring the right folks. Allowing to have a good experience from a system is also super important. So making sure that you have those right systems in place and the process and policies that they understand. Just one thing at Snowflake that I'll mention is when I arrived there, there really was very minimal procurement, and folks were still mad because there really wasn't procurement. And so they were mad because, they were dealing with all of the security side of it, the legal side of it, and then also the procurement side of it. And it's really about, kind of bringing all of those together and making them one team as procurement, legal, and privacy, and also security. And, I kind of sell to them that procurement is kind of, that gate that is going to help them get through all of those other things that they go through. So that's kind of also how I sell it internally is, we're the partners of the business, and we kind of work for them. So.
Now, to that point about sort of coming into a procurementless void, what a horrible idea in a company. Did you find, or well, let me put it this way. Did you find it easy to figure out where the line should be between procurement creating systems and processes and guidelines and frameworks and all those things we love so much to build a positive experience, versus the areas where you were able to say, you know what, the best way for me to give you a good employee experience is to sort of set up some guideposts and then leave you alone? How did you go about figuring out, as you built out some of the formality of the program, which pieces should really just be left to empower people to meet their own requirements, and where you needed to provide a little bit more structure and guidance for them?
Yeah, it was super important, I think, when I arrived, that because procurement wasn't utilized, I don't think, correctly prior, because it was a small company, it was a startup, and so really what you were looking to do is take those high-risk things and create policy around things that we wanted to be engaged with from a security and compliance and a legal standpoint, and then allowing the business to make some decisions on their own when it came to some of the lower risk items. And so I think with a fast growing company, you can't just hire a bunch of folks to come in and just handle all of procurement. And so that's definitely not my strategy. The strategy for me was to take all the high risk items and take care of them, and then kind of build a team that is going to eventually handle 100% of the engagement in procurement. So that was kind of the strategy that I took, is high risk to low risk kind of mentality.
Well, it is interesting too, because you sort of wonder, where does the procurement experience begin and end, right? If we're in procurement, do we get to have a procurement experience? Are we personally part of creating it? Colin, I've had the opportunity to actually speak with a number of Zips clients, and I tend to find them to be people who genuinely love their work, right? I probably have a whole handful of dollars if I ask them all how they got into procurement. To what extent have you all found, either through helping companies figure out the intake process or simply implementing the solution, that a procurement experience for the other employees starts with people that are happy to be in procurement?
Yeah, I think you have to have people that understand the process well enough to figure out where the big pain points are. And there's pretty common pain points around just visibility and around understanding which systems to go to when. I think there's a quote that I've heard a couple times from several customers around this idea, which is buyers are not necessarily trying to do something bad. They're not trying to break the rules. They're not trying to go outside the process. They're just trying to get their job done. So the thing that we find, and what a lot of our clients we work closely with, is they're not trying to solve a problem of people breaking rules nefariously. They're trying to create a situation where people can follow the rules easily because they want to. They want to go through the right process. They want to be in compliance, but they need that little bit of help or that extra sort of functionality of our system to make that process easy and create sort of a walled garden where you can't really break the rules because all the rules are sort of built into the logic of the intake and the approval flow and all those other things that are going to come with it.
Yeah. Now, I have one more question that I want to ask you, Joe, and then I understand there's already a lot of back and forth going in the Q&A. So after I ask you this, I'm going to come over to Phil to see how that discussion is going. But Joe, even though we got this question in advance, it seems perfectly suited to you. It's a question from Kerry. If your procurement organization is new, so this should be an easy thing for you to imagine, how do you approach stakeholders that do not feel the need for formal procurement to encourage them to start working with you and create a positive experience right from the outset?
Yeah, I think this goes back to initially when I started, and not just at Snowflake, but with any company. I do those first initial meetings with our corporate legal team, with our FP&A team, with our security teams to understand their processes and where some of those issues are. And I think it's super important to understand those and make those teams part of your team as well. And so gain partnerships along all of those things through the buy side process. And then you get kind of allies on your side before you go and you meet with these business stakeholders that are brand new and they don't want to necessarily or don't think that you add any value. But then I think it's super important to just, and honestly, if I've sat down with a business stakeholder and by the end of that meeting, even if it's a half-hour meeting, if they still don't see a need for utilizing procurement, then I think that they probably shouldn't be working at our company, is what I would say, just bluntly. But I've never had pushback once I sit down and I explain, hey, look, from a budget standpoint, I'm partnering with FP&A to understand and keep you within your budget. And then from a security and from a legal and from a privacy standpoint, I'm also trying to get your deals done as fast as possible and through these other swim lanes, so that we as a company, we're all stakeholders in this company, achieve what we need out of this. And honestly, one of the big things that I always tell my stakeholders that they would hear is, you tell me the date that you need it by, I will get it done. And so we all know in procurement that may not always be the case, but I think a lot of times the business wants to hear that, if they tell you a date, that you're going to make it everything possible to get it done by that date. And so what's been super important is those initial meetings that I've had with the business after I create the internal synergies with the teams that it takes to process things, and then also meeting with them and explaining to them why those things are important, and making them feel part of the team as well and part of the decision making. So it's really just taking baby steps and building different success stories internally with those stakeholders. So it's a lot of work, and everybody's different. But I do think that there is a successful formula to each person and winning them over.
Yeah. Now, let me pause us there for just a minute. Phil, let me give you the floor and bring in some of the questions and discussion that have been happening offside in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And there's just a couple of questions that kind of build on some of the things that Colin and Joe have said so far. And Colin, I actually just want to say something you mentioned that really stood out to me that is really worth iterating or reiterating is that people do want to follow the rules. We just sometimes make it too hard for them to do so. And that's when they go and do their own thing. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. You know, a question around, and I think this will be a good question for both you, Colin, and for you, Joe. Colin, you said at the very beginning around customer priorities, you know, getting to understand the priorities of, stakeholder priorities and getting to understand the priorities of your stakeholder as a place to start building that relationship. How do you kind of approach things if those priorities conflict, or if they're priorities that perhaps you don't think are truly aligned with the needs of the business? You know, because we're in this environment where, and we're talking about, we want to create a good positive experience for them, but we also have to sometimes respectfully challenge what they want to do.
Yep. No, I mean, it's not a question of if they're going to conflict. They're definitely going to conflict. Like there's an inherent sort of tension in the system in the procurement process, right? And Joe mentioned a second ago, you've got FP&A on one side pulling you to meet your budgets and keep costs low. You've got, you know, ops or engineering or IT or marketing pulling you on the other side to spend more money to accomplish their, you know, objectives and their deliverables. So there's going to always be that tension. The thing I found most, you're gonna have a hard time winning the budget battle. You're not going to get that to move much. That's really outside of your capability. But I've seen a ton of success personally, and with other people I've watched operate in the procurement space, with going to looping the stakeholder into the process. And so rather than making a black box and saying, okay, give me your request, I'll go work on it, and then I'll come back and tell you when it's done, keeping them in the loop, letting them know what's happening, letting them share in the win. You know, for better or worse, organizations today are putting more and more budget pressure on, you know, at the organization level. So there's a lot of benefit and a lot of kudos for them to get with their management by coming back and saying, hey, remember how I budgeted, you know, $300K for this? We got it for, you know, $225. Like that's a win for them, and let them share in that win with you and let them be a part of that. And if you can do that, you'll be surprised how quickly they're more flexible with their dates. If you loop them in, keep them in the flow of the conversation and what's happening in the procurement process, so that they know, hey, this is happening. Here's what we're going to lose a week, but on the net of it, we're going to get these other benefits by taking more time to do this the right way. That's where I've seen sort of be the most successful, and you know, the only real way to really address the inherent sort of tension in the system.
Thanks, Colin. How do you approach that tension at Snowflake, and how do you coach your team on doing the same, Joe?
I think Colin hit it spot on, as in, you know, if you make them part of the process and you create the visibility into the process, that they're going to feel like they're part of the team as well. And that's really what everybody wants, is to, you know, work together as a team to achieve something. I know with my team specifically, I still sit down and have training with buyers because I still remember when I was a buyer and I used to come in and I used to touch base one by one with every single one of my stakeholders the first thing in the morning, and I would just go down my list and do it, because those are the things that that really help things from being escalated internally. And it's just about the communication and keeping folks updated as to what's going on, whether it be through a person, through a system. It's both of those are super critical. So I agree with Colin on that.
Thanks, Joe. And there's a question that came in from Cheryl that's actually along those same lines. So the answer may be the same, but I do want to just pose it, and I'll pose it to you, Joe. Is you know, you talked about setting dates and you know, working to the dates of the business to achieve ultimately what they're trying to drive for. What if some of the lines of business or partners that you work with in the business that you need to get involved with don't make those dates? You know, how do you kind of shine a light on that in a way that's not throwing people under the bus, but also not putting you out in front of the bus to be hit, so to speak?
Yeah, and this really comes down to how critical whatever it is that's being purchased is going into our ecosystem, how critical that item is. Is it business impacting or not? And so a lot of times what I would do is look, if somebody's coming to me and I don't feel like we have an SLA from security that's 2 weeks and maybe they want it done in 3 days, my first call would be to the head of security and say, hey, look, we have this business critical item. And what does your queue look like for reviewing things? And so I guess to a point, if I say a date, I will escalate all the way up to the top of these to discuss what decisions need to be made in order to either make this date or not. And I have no shame in going all the way up, even to the CFO or to our CIO to try to get something done for the business, because it goes back to kind of something I said earlier, which is if you create these good relationships with, number one, you have the the support of your leadership, but also the leadership of these other teams. The hope is that you can make those dates. But I will say, there have been times when we haven't made those dates. If it's not something that's business critical, I would go back to the business and say, hey, look, these are the reasons why that date is going to slip. But I would bring in other teams and escalate through other teams so that we're all on the same page and that everybody understands why it's not going to meet that date. But it is super important, I think, that if you do say that, that you have those alliances on those other workflows and to where that you can escalate if needed to make that date happen. So I thought that question might come back.
I do have one last question before I can hand it back to Kelly, and that is, you talked a little bit about being in staff meetings, having your SMEs in staff meetings. Was that kind of a byproduct of the relational work that you've talked about in building that with the business, or did you get some pushback to start with when you showed up and you said, hey, I want my team in your meetings? Like, how did that play out?
No, I don't. I really no pushback, surprisingly. Maybe earlier in my career, yes, but no pushback at Snowflake when asked to be involved in, the meeting of the CMO directs or an IT all hands or things like that. And it's also one of the super good things that I like about, I think the technology companies, Snowflake, and even when I was at ServiceNow, everybody was really open about, hey, come to our meetings. We want to share what our projects are with you. Although in my past, I have been, maybe turned down a time or two from wanting to come to leadership meetings. But I think if you sell it in the right way, as in you're just trying to, actually, I do have a good example I just thought of. There was pushback at a prior company at ServiceNow where one of the leaders of the team did not want me to come to her meeting, and I actually just told her admin, I just said, look, all of your projects are coming to me to get approved, and they will sit with me until I meet with your leadership and I talk to you about X, Y, and Z, because there was some leadership changes, and sometimes when you do get new folks that come into a company, they don't know the culture of the company, and so super important that when folks do start, you meet with them early when they start in a company. And I think in this case, it was just once I got in front of her, she understood the impact and didn't have any issues going forward. But definitely important to win them over.
Awesome. Thank you, Phil. Thank you to everybody that's participating in the chat. We love to get that live feedback and questions. And Joe, what you were just sharing there in that specific story actually ties back to what the four of us were talking about before hitting go live on today's broadcast, which is you can't expect to be in procurement and not face pushback sometimes, and on occasion, some heckling. If you can't handle those, maybe this is not the field for you. And so it's, hitting those instances, figuring out how to work past them, and I guess knowing where you have leverage and figuring out how to diplomatically use it. Now, to your point about approving all of these different transactions, I have one more question that I'll ask both of you about experience, and then we'll kind of merge off into corporate culture. But Joe, so starting with you, what are some of the most common examples of where the procurement process creates friction? Maybe like you talked about approvals, maybe it's knowing how to get the process started or handling sort of supplier discovery or pre-qualification, some of those things that can add some length to a decision-making process. Where are those examples of friction associated with procurement, and which ones do you think have more of a tendency to hold us back or have a negative impact on the experience that people associate with us?
There's a bunch of classic ones I'll skip. Maybe I'll leave those for Colin. But the ones that I've seen really emerging in the last 5 or 10 years, it has been in these areas of our business partners where all of a sudden, security is, everything is a SaaS solution now, and security takes an extreme amount of time in order to get through, and so does privacy. And so these areas have become what the business would look at as bottlenecks, and it kind of points back to the procurement process. So for us, it's really about partnering, with those folks and understanding, how long SLAs are going to take on certain types of software. Also creating visibility into the processes of those processes, because I know one of the big gaps at Snowflake was just they submitted something, but the business had no idea where it was at through the entire process. And so that's something that I know a lot of companies have. Almost every company I've worked for historically has folks have said, hey, you know what? I submitted this 2 weeks ago and I have no idea where it's at. Your buyer might keep telling me that it's, with such and such, but who is that? Where is that at? And what's the SLA for that? And so I think creating partnerships, SLAs, and visibility is super critical into those processes today, because folks look at them today as real gatekeepers of the process. So
yeah. Now, Colin, what would you add to that when you think sort of about the different friction point across all of the different clients that you work with? Additional points, similar points across all companies?
Yeah, absolutely what Joe mentioned around the rise of, not the rise of, but just the heightened importance of security and privacy. Without a doubt, that's a top one, and one of the slowest approval steps in any procurement request approval process. I think one area that was historically more of a direct procurement problem and has become more of an indirect procurement problem is just the sprawl of spend, right? I think there's historically that was a direct procurement problem. Like, hey, we want to consolidate our direct purchases with these sort of core suppliers that are critical to us, that we have better pricing with. Indirect procurement didn't really have as much of that problem because you didn't have duplicative systems or like redundant software, technology, consulting partners, things like that. With the way things are going, with the growth of indirect spend the last 5-10 years, and the growth of SaaS and all these other things, we're actually seeing the same problems in that arena, which is how do we get people to consolidate around a single solution across different teams, or how do we leverage our spend across different teams rather than buying 15 licenses here, 15 licenses there, and have a coordinated approach. So that causes friction, because you may be telling one team, hey, you can't buy this collaboration software because you already have these 2 others, and they really want that one for some features that are key to their business. So there's some inherent friction there, and that's procurement's job to address and to sort of mediate those sort of which one's the best solution. And I think procurement's getting better about that, with running more collaborative RFP processes and sort of getting ahead of these things and making those strategic decisions earlier, rather than waiting until someone's trying to buy, the 4th ticketing system, and it's like, we already have 3, like, let's put the brakes on this. And having like a strategy at a high level around these key, software and other indirect procurement categories. I think that's one we're seeing a lot with our customers, and one we're trying to help with, but definitely a pain point and a friction point for procurement.
Well, it is interesting, and I do think it's a sign of progress, actually. There's always going to be friction points, but back in the day, in the olden days with the wagon wheels and all that, when I was a procurement practitioner, it tended to be more of a "you're not the boss of me" kind of, right? Like, the value proposition associated with procurement had not been embraced enough for us to even get entrance into meetings or be accepted as a worthwhile internal collaborator. And now it sounds like it's a lot around transparency into where is my request in the process, and then total elapsed time from when somebody identifies a need to when the product shows up at their desk or the service starts to go into practice. So even through those friction points, it does sound like we're making progress, and there's always going to be something that we could do better, right? but at least those friction points are addressable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So as we move on into company culture and sort of keeping all the things that we've discussed around experience in the back of our minds, Joe, what can you tell us about the overall corporate culture at Snowflake and how that gets factored into the procurement team's priorities and objectives and ways of interacting with the rest of the business, specifically from procurement to the rest of the company?
Our culture, it's we're growing super fast, so everything that we're looking at doing, it's kind of building to scale. I think from a culture standpoint, one of the main culture points that I love about Snowflake is I think the cross-functional teamwork that happens. Every team I think that I've worked with, is striving to be world class, and so it really raises the level as to what you want to do inside of your own team. So I think from a culture standpoint, super fast moving, teamwork oriented. Just as an example, like within my first week that I started at Snowflake, I was approached by the data engineering team on how we can design a better way for master data management. And it's like just these types of things where folks want to take on problems and solve them as a team and bring procurement, and strategic sourcing in and do something really cool that other companies maybe haven't thought of or done. Being part of that culture is just it's super satisfying and makes you excited to work and to build teams every day. So I think the one thing I would say from a culture standpoint is teamwork, cross-functional teamwork.
And Colin, how would you say that compares to the range of corporate cultures that you and your team work with, especially in terms of how that corporate culture then drives how procurement gets their work done and what they focus on?
Yeah, this has actually been super interesting for me because I didn't have a lot of companies that I worked at in procurement, before, just two pretty large organizations, and so coming here and seeing all of our customers and sort of how they approach procurement's been super eye-opening because there's very large amounts of variation between from customer to customer. I'd say the one most interesting things about our clients that I love seeing is where does procurement sit within the organization? Because that's not like a foregone conclusion. Like is it within finance? Is it within IT? Is it within is it its own separate tent pole? Is it within operations? There's a lot of different places procurement can sit, and I think that actually, for a procurement organization, makes a big difference in terms of how those priorities get stacked up, and then also how the company communicates the focus of the procurement team, because it can vary widely across different organizations, and even two procurement teams that report up into finance are not identical, because if your CFO views procurement as being strategic and as being a key driver of business value, they're going to view it very differently. If they view it as a rubber stamp and just something they need to do to satisfy auditors and to show they have controls, that's also a different experience. So I think that trickles down a ton, and I didn't think it made that much of a difference, but seeing it live across a lot of different clients has been interesting, and I think that can lead to pros and cons no matter what. And I think as a procurement leader, you need to think about that. Where do I sit in the organization, and how do I help maybe counterbalance some of those influences in culture in how I approach my stakeholders.
Yeah. So that's kind of the cultural look at it, but there's also a factor which is could either look at it as business model or just how big of a margin your business generates, right? You're going to have a very different perspective on procurement in pharma, say, than you're going to have in grocery retail. Have you seen any correlation between the industry a company's in, a guess at their profit margin, and how that drives company culture and therefore procurement's objectives?
1,000,000%, yes. I mean, procurement can play a lot of different roles, and depending on what stage of growth you're in, those priorities are very different. If you're a healthcare company, if you're a pharmaceutical company, compliance and regulatory impact on the process is probably it's like the #1 priority. I think if you're in a high growth software company, it's more just sort of getting your hands around things and maybe getting some of the steps in place that maybe you need to prepare for an IPO, or to prepare for maybe some controls issues you had in the past, or maybe just get some small handle around costs because you're if you're growing really fast, you can start to sort of spend like a drunken sailor pretty quickly if you don't have that team. And procurement generally gets added a little bit too late when you're in that hyper growth mode, because money isn't the issue, scaling is the issue. And so that also can become a different challenge. So we've seen that with a lot of our customers, and it's been great having them come to us and explain their company culture, where they're at, what the pain points are, and then us helping them sort of tailor the solution to get control around, or to get some process around those different areas where they're maybe seeing escapes or seeing issues.
Yeah. Now, Joe, you've shared that you're in fast growth mode at Snowflake, and you had also mentioned that you're not that big of a company. Are you, though, big enough yet where you have sort of pockets of priority? So I'll go with the super stereotypical marketing says, I don't need to save money. It just has to be awesome because we're growing the top line. Whereas somebody that's actually in R&D or product development or ops is more like, I'm checking between the couch cushions to find anything spare. Are you big enough yet that you have different, somebody's very focused on value, somebody's very focused on cost, or are everybody's eyes sort of on that growth horizon?
I think everybody's eyes are on it, but you do see differences in the culture of different teams, similar to how you asked. If we're working with IT, I think a lot of times the subject is, hey, how can we go back and save money and give back our budget? And I think in other areas, examples in marketing, where if you do really go after a good negotiation in marketing, and you save money, a lot of times that goes back into the ad space, or it goes back into other areas. So we are big enough to see, some of those classic differences in some of the organizations that larger companies would have as well. So, and we do scale to have sourcing managers that are aligned with all of those different business units as well. So from marketing and IT and HR, we have sourcing managers that align with all of them. So.
Now, one of the other interesting things that we're sort of seeing run against companies and categories alike is the impact of the Great Recession, as they're calling it, right? People are deciding, I've done this office job my whole life, and now I want to, sing to flowers. I want to paint. I want to, travel and be a nomad. And so companies are very conscious of anything that they do, back to this idea of culture and experience, that might cause people to leave, because it's incredibly hard to find people to then fill those roles. Joe, can you talk at all in terms of how maybe some of the shifts over the last couple of years, maybe being concerned about trying to retain the best talent even more than would be under more stable conditions, has increased the emphasis on making sure that the company has what it needs to be operationally effective, and make sure that the experience is good at the same time without giving into people's whims. Any thoughts about how those two things are coming together?
Yeah, I think we've organically talked about it a little bit today on how, in general, procurement has been viewed over time, and really since COVID, there's even been more stress on procurement, because it makes being part of the business even harder when you can't necessarily walk to their desk and see them, or now it's just a Zoom meeting, and you only have so much time for Zoom meetings in one day. And so I'll be completely transparent in that, from my boss down, having that experience for our employees, it is super important. And maybe 10 years ago, my boss and maybe the CIO both would have said, hey, let's make it so difficult that nobody wants to do anything with procurement so we don't spend any money. And so I mean, I think we've all had bosses that might have said that in the past, but I think that there is a huge shift in that. We do want to make it easier on folks to engage with procurement, and we want to create that visibility into the process, and then we want it to be a good experience so that folks can, when they come to work, it has maybe that Amazon look and feel when they shop. That Amazon look and feel comes over to the procurement side as well. And so I do think that procurement and part of the culture change has been to make it easier and more transparent on the business. So
yeah. Well, and that's a great transition. So, Colin, as we think about sort of what people expect from a B2C buying experience, we don't completely close the door in between our personal and professional lives, especially if we're literally staying in the same seat. How have you seen companies find a way to reflect their corporate culture and priorities around their technology strategy? You know, whether that's through user experience or the areas that they choose to prioritize for digital investment. How have you seen those two things come together?
Yeah, I think we've seen more of a bleeding line between consumer and enterprise apps, and just sort of the desire to, tech savvy attitudes have now sort of slipped into the enterprise space, where previously, people could sort of look at a bad user interface and go, well, it's an accounting system, it's not supposed to be pretty, and you sort of shrug your shoulders. But I think we've gotten, with Slack and with some of these other tools, we've gotten sort of almost like a consumer-like experience in an enterprise setting, and people want more of that. And we've heard from a number of our clients at the executive level, at the C-suite, that they have company priorities around improving this, and specific feedback around issues with the procurement process or with the procurement tools that they have to use, because frankly a lot of the technology out there is pretty antiquated, and so that comes with an antiquated UI, and people's tolerance for that is diminishing, especially as the rest of their tech stack becomes more and more modern and more user friendly. So I think that's where we've actually caught a natural wave with our product, in the sense that people want to upgrade that experience, and procurement inherently is going, like I said before, it's going to have that tension. So if we can add some sort of improved user experience to make that slightly more appealing for folks to come in through the front door of a procurement process, that's going to pay huge dividends for the company, and it's going to make people that much more excited to work with procurement rather than having to go trudge through some really old system.
Yeah. Now, same with you, Colin, and it's interesting that you talk about, seeing a lot of companies do this. I know that there are a lot of relatively new, fast growth companies that have embraced the Zip value proposition, but there are also cases where there's companies that have been around for a while and just now they have a new head of procurement that brings in a different perspective on things.
Yep.
What do you see around that change management element? I mean, I guess it's probably a subset of corporate culture, but what does the attitude towards both change management in terms of rolling it out and how it affects people, but then also sort of the catalyst perspective on change management, what it requires in a single owner or a small procurement team to say, this is the friction point that if we can address it, the whole experience starts to change. What are some things you can observe about how companies deal with change and the doors that opens for procurement?
Yeah, I think the sales pitch really goes to what we talked about earlier, which is just that user experience. When you go talk to people, they don't want to change because they're trained up on the old system. The process is what they know. If you're a more established company, larger company, or a slower growth company, making those changes is not natural. If you're a fast growth company, you're changing all the time. So yeah. Change is a little bit of comes with the game, like Snowflake, right? Like you have to be nimble in an organization like that. But for customers and for companies that are more in a static or slower growth mode, the value proposition is, hey, look, there's going to come with these changes, but our favorite thing to do is when we first kick off with a customer is share a video, show them how the product works, so people can get excited about all the benefits they're going to get, and it makes it easier for them to get comfortable with the changes and having to learn a new system and other things like that. But being able to get notifications in Slack, being able to approve in Slack, being able to quickly see where a request is in the approval process, those are the things that people have wanted for years and just didn't think were possible in a procurement platform.
Yeah. Now, Joe, when we think about culture, I mean, I think it's probably a typical piece of advice that sort of culture comes from the top down. And yet over time, as teams exist and functional directors have their own way of doing things, you can kind of get different sorts of pockets of culture embedded throughout the organization. When you think about addressing that and then aligning procurement, do you tend to focus on where the C-suite is focused and aligned with that? Is that consistently aligned with, let's say, like the people, right, making up the rest of the culture? Or do you have cases where sometimes you almost need to understand what's going on in a distributed way and sort of elevate some of that to the C-level so that it can be addressed appropriately through both technology and process?
I think to have that alignment with leadership first is key. And then, there's been examples of where you turn your head for a couple months and there could be a whole new team of 10 folks that you don't even know exist in the company. And maybe it was, a senior director that was hired and they brought all of their folks from, PayPal, and maybe they have their own culture that they brought over. And I think it's super important that, you still have that alignment with leadership, so that when you do find that pocket of 10 people that you didn't know about, or however many, that you can talk about the culture that the company does have, and you can talk in confidence that, hey, there's an alignment here with your leadership and everybody else, that, these are the processes, and we will have somebody assigned to you, a buyer and a sourcing manager, that is going to help you through this process. But finding those folks and staying ahead of those small culture pockets that might create change, it's super important, because to your point, Kelly, if you don't find them, it can spread and it can get bigger. And if you just leave marketing alone for 6 months, you could come back to something that is totally different than what you had went through and hopefully got them accustomed to prior to that. So it's super important.
And I think that if there's anything that we all know from being around a while, if you leave marketing alone for too long, they will completely go back to nature. And that's definitely not what we want. We want to keep some type of consistently involved, procurement alignment. So Joe, one more question for you, and then I'm going to check in with Phil and see what's going on in the chat. You talked about starting your day by kind of going down your list of connections. And I think when you said it, you were talking about an earlier position. To what extent is that, if not process, then mindset and philosophy still evident in your work now? And to what extent does the ability of a system like Zip alleviate the need for you to do that, and you sort of redirect some of those energies to relationship building in a different way?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm much too old that it's burnt inside of me, that I wake at 4 a.m. every day, and those things come into my mind, and they start hitting me like, who do I need to talk to today? Who do I need to touch base with? I think that over the past 20 some years since I've been working in procurement, what I have seen change, though, and it does change your habits, is when technologies do exist that maybe take away some of those burdens of that checklist every day. You can be more strategic with your work. And so I think from the standpoint of a platform like Zip, what they allow you to do is really give transparency to your business stakeholders into the process. And so that's what I really love is I hope that over time, and maybe we can keep some metrics of this, of the emails coming into our because we have a procurement inbox, the emails that come into the procurement inbox asking questions about things, those things go down because the transparency is right in front of them from a system standpoint. So then it's just about that change management of like, hey, you might not get that email from Joe in the morning, but what you do have is something within your Okta that you can click on that visually shows you where something is at, as opposed to having to go to your email and read it. But those things are still burned into me. Even we have Zip. We could probably add 1,000 zips, and I still would probably wake up and think like, oh man, I gotta still touch base with this business owner. But I do think from a buyer standpoint, from a sourcing manager standpoint, it's a huge help to have that visualization into the process that keeps folks updated. So. Yeah.
So let me pause there, Phil, and bring you in. What additional questions and comments have you had come in based upon the conversation that Joe and Colin and I have had?
Sure, and I want to say we've had some love for your background, Kelly. So you're scoring well on Room Rater today with your Boston Library.
Reviews, we need those.
I actually have two questions. The first one is actually my own. I'm interested in something that Joe had said earlier. At Art of Procurement, we've long advocated for the putting in place of SLAs for procurement between procurement and our stakeholders, because one, it drives accountability, and two, it gives that service provider mindset to the teams. And Joe, you mentioned, I think really in the middle of our conversation around having some SLAs in place. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what are the kind of things that you're measuring, and was that a change, or is that actually all part of the culture at Snowflake that enabled you to do that?
It is a culture change for us, because I think that, and it could be a culture change for anybody in the industry as well, maybe in the security and the legal and privacy areas, because I think, over the course of time, nobody has put a stopwatch on legal or security. But I do think, it's super important to be transparent about, hey, if you have this type of engagement, how long is it going to take to get through the process end to end? And so, Philip, to your point, I had to go and really work with those teams about, creating those SLAs. And it is a little bit of a battle when you go to legal and you talk to them about, hey, we need an SLA for when you're working on a SaaS MSA. And they're like, well, it could be 2 pages, it could be our paper, it could be their paper, it could be 50 pages. And so I think, coming up with those as a team is super important, and not giving up. So if you go and you try to sell it and they say no, continue to work at trying to create an SLA with those business partners. If anything, you create an expectation from the business. And in the procurement space, what you can do is partner with them as you go through the engagement, because we're still partnering with legal, we're still partnering with privacy to understand if that SLA is going to get broken or if we're going to beat that SLA. So I just think that not having a number is much worse than having a number that might not be plus or minus 2 or 3 days.
Right.
So that's transparency that I want for the business.
Thanks, John. I have one last question. I'm going to first pose this to you, Colin, and that's the idea of, we were talking obviously about the procurement experience, and arguably the best procurement experience from a stakeholder perspective is when procurement doesn't get involved at all. They have that true consumer-like experience where they're just using some guided buying or some self-service kind of approaches. And I just wondered what your perspective was, and Joe, the same for you as well, once Colin's had the opportunity to share his thoughts on this, is, should we be moving towards an environment where we are encouraging more guided buying or self-service sourcing to help that experience, especially in organizations that we've talked about today, where speed and scale is really important?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we've seen the rise of it with, Punchouts obviously is a very simple version of that, where it's, you need a thing, go buy the thing. But I think, there's more and more opportunities for things like that with self-guided buying, or potentially creating fast track approval processes for certain types of purchases, where it's like, hey, this doesn't need the whole approval, even though it's this dollar amount, we're going to skip over some of these certain steps and streamlining that process for them. And I think also just, you can't identify the issues with the process and the bottlenecks unless you have those insights, unless you have that data and those metrics. So unless you're really properly tracking it, which we found that the vast majority of our customers before they bought Zip didn't have any real good ways of tracking those things. So having that data gives them the ability to then go talk to those teams and be like, hey, you're 5th in the approval chain, but you take the longest. Can we get you to start a little bit earlier? And what things can you do to tweak your process to make those things more streamlined? I think that's a big piece. And the guided buying piece also helps with that, because then it's, if it's a certain type of purchase and it's already been pre-cleared, you can potentially skip over some of those steps or make those steps clear faster in a way that's, still going to provide the right compliance checks, going to give you the right, confirmation that that's been signed off, but streamline things for the end user.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's those purchases that ultimately determine the perception of procurement from the wider organization, because that's the biggest day-to-day interaction that they have with us. It's not their experience on the big stuff, because they don't have many of those, but they're working every day to buy kind of the nuts and bolts they need to operate the business. And Joe, I'm just going to ask that same to you. Your thoughts on self-service or guided buying as part of the puzzle in driving a more positive experience for stakeholders.
Yeah, it's definitely important. I think that it's also a culture thing as well, because if from a leadership standpoint, as an example, my boss would say, I take him metrics that show that we're involved. Hey, procurement is involved with 45% of the spend that comes through us, and then his question would always be, why can't it be 100? And then, so, from a procurement standpoint, what I'm striving for is to have what I would measure as engagement on 100% of our spend. And so what I strive for is, whether it's through a buyer, a sourcing manager, we're doing those negotiations to get engaged on the spend. And then it's all about, what other technologies are out there that would handle some sort of punch out and handle, like, if this negotiated price with CDW matches X on a monitor, is there automation that can be created so that it's touchless for a business stakeholder? And so, there are those technologies out there that exist, and I love them when they work, but it would have to be something from a culture standpoint that I could go back to my boss and say, you know what, from an engagement standpoint, we are engaged because, there is we have a cost plus for all of these items that are going through the system. And then it's just automation through that. But, the culture that I'm under is one that we do want to be engaged with all the spend. And we want somebody to have an eye on it, but definitely want the automation as well. So when those fit together, I'm all for it.
I guess it's like the age-old, what's the definition of engaged, isn't it? You look at all the spend under management metrics, and spend under management being kind of a similar idea where everyone's striving to show as high a spend under management as possible. But there's a lot of different ways to measure that calculation, which renders most benchmarks kind of irrelevant because some people are vastly, there's a lot of different inputs depending on who's measuring it.
Yeah, and I went through this with my boss as well, as in when you show what engaged means from our standpoint, it means that there was somebody on our team was engaged. They did an attempt to negotiate, and they also did a red line on a document that was a substantial improvement from the company's stance on that document. So engagement for us means that there was a negotiation and also or a redlined document that we sent on and got approved. So that's what engagement means for us. Might mean different. You're right, Philip. It could mean different things for different folks.
We could probably do a whole new episode just on spend under management. But thank you on that. I know we're coming towards the end of time, Kelly, so I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you, everybody who joined live and asked questions. I guess here, final note, Colin and Joe. Colin, I'll start with you. What is the best way for people to get in touch if they would like to reach out and talk more about what we've discussed today, or potentially have a question about Zip?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way to get a hold of me. But yeah, definitely encourage anyone if they have questions about procurement or about anything, not even zip related or unzip related. Would love to connect and love talking to other procurement professionals about their career and things that they're trying to accomplish.
And Joe, final question for you. If people don't feel like their own procurement team checks in with them often enough, are you willing to add people not at Snowflake to your hit list for every morning?
Yeah, maybe. Well, we'd have to see the circumstances.
Well, if people want to at least take their chances, what's the best way for them to reach out and get in touch with you?
Definitely, same as Colin. LinkedIn is great. So feel free to reach out. Appreciate the time today. This was awesome.
Now, this was a great session, and we took on some big topics, experience and culture, all in 1 hour. So thank you so much to everybody that's joined us. Thank you to everybody who will listen on demand in the future. Appreciate you spending some time with us, and have a great rest of your day.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.